So, John, thank you for your time. I'm delighted to have this conversation with you as a person who influenced DevOps movement so much during these years. Thank you for this talk.
Sure, glad to be here.
Maybe for the people not familiar with your work, can you tell us what you and Adaptive Capacity Labs focus on currently?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, what you could say is that we're focused on helping organizations learn from incidents in deeper and broader ways. And there's a couple of different ways we do that, but they all sort of hinge on the same stance, which is learning from incidents is something that is perhaps not intuitive in the industry right now, but you can get good at it. And when we say learning, we don't mean fixing. We actually mean learning. And so we bring we work with different clients in different ways. But certainly they all sort of stand on fundamentals of learning from incidents that have sort of been borne out in other industries and domains, and leans heavily on methods and techniques from accident investigation. And so the approaches we take look quite different than what is currently or typically conventionally seen as postmortems in the SRE or or other sort of frames such as that. It's a different approach. So that's what we're focused on.
Great. I saw your talk at the DevOps Enterprise Summit last month, and a lot of things there resonated with me, particularly your conclusion in the end that we as an industry suck at incident management. So why do we as an industry suck at incident management? What are some of the typical problems and symptoms that you see out there in the wild?
Right. Well, first, let me ask a clarifying question, because we get this question quite often. When you say incident management, sometimes people will say incident management when they're intending to mean the response to an incident. Sometimes they'll say incident management when they're talking about the sort of the post-incident activities, which is the one that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think that, that's a good question, because a lot of times that we talk with people somehow perceive incident management as something like post-mortem and something let's fix it and let's talk about it. Let's learn something from it.
Mm-hmm.
This learning something doesn't seem to actually happen, at least not in the way that we want it to happen.
Yeah. So let me answer it this way. If we think about all of the incidents that could be taking place, but are not, right? It means that incidents are, in a real sense, extremely rare compared to when there aren't incidents, right? And so if you ask the question, what makes us good at preventing incidents? Well, to some extent, it's our experience with past incidents that allows us to anticipate scenarios in the future, right? And so, one of the things that, and again, it's just a disconnect, much like a disconnect in the early sort of DevOps, movement. The dialogue was a disconnect between application developers and operations engineers. And the notion that these two folks could make efforts to understand each other's work and their goals, and I don't know, maybe even share tips and tricks and tools and that sort of thing, could yield some positive benefit. The same goes with incident analysis. I would put the state of the industry, which is a very big, broad stroke here, so I'm making a blanket generalization, to support my point. But I would say that we are most predominantly focused on fixing. Here's an incident. That was terrible. We don't want that to happen again. And so naturally, it makes sense that what you would do is, let's figure out what we can do. Doing a thing, fixing, coming up with specific things you can do, action items, follow-ups, all that sort of thing, has a somewhat of an emotional value to it, because that can provide us some that can at least provide us the, whether it's illusory or not, whether it's an illusion or not is a different story, but it can give us this feeling that we've done something, that we can have control over our future. And incidents represent these surprises. They come out of nowhere. At the beginning of an incident, it's quite very difficult sometimes to figure out, especially at the very beginning, is this just a bad afternoon? Or is this the big one? Is this the one that sinks our company, right? Is this the one that we cannot come back from? And those are really uncomfortable, feelings. And so the way that we cope with that, from an engineering sense, we're engineers. We want to fix things. We want to improve things.
We know how to do that.
Exactly. And in fact, we could say that what makes us successful as engineers is this innate, almost instinctual desire to fix things. The problem becomes when these, by definition, complex events, if they weren't complicated or complex, we anticipate all of the straightforward things. Those are the things that we call incidents, right? We might just call those bugs, or, for the most part, all of the straightforward stuff is handled. Don't cause problems. The things that do surprise us, by definition, are things that we hadn't anticipated. And so therefore, the mistake, the disconnect, is the idea that we can come up with things to fix without first understanding in a real sense where this came from. How were we surprised? What's difficult about this? I would take the stance, and my colleagues, and more and more people would take the stance that and it sounds really obvious, of course, so did continuous delivery and DevOps sounds obvious in hindsight, right? If you have a better, richer understanding of the incident, you will have more productive things to do about it in the future. If your goal is to come up with the things to do, to fix, then you're not necessarily going to be focused on getting a description that's useful for people who weren't there, right? Learning is about, if a learning organization is an organization that really attempts to learn, I would argue that the approach should be to have the greatest number of people in the organization gain insight from these events, the deepest insight as they can, right? You want to maximize the broadest audience and the deepest insight. To come back to your question, why does the industry suck at this? I think it's largely just an immaturity. It's an evolution that we sort of have to come to understand that doing this well is possible, and you just have to practice and develop some skills that you otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah. This after all gives us a bit of confidence and hope that things can be improved also in this area.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah. I remember your quote in the talk in the DevOps Enterprise Summit where you described the way we do incident management. You said, we think we are doing astronomy, but we end up actually doing astrology. So
yeah. I actually regret saying that, because the point that I wanted to get is can be sort of distracting. I certainly did not want to disparage folks involved in astrology. Just to be clear on that. But yeah, what sort of underpins the point I was trying to make is these incident metrics that you find almost sort of ubiquitous. Some of them represent averages, right? Mean time to something, and it's always mean time to, as if time is the only, or certainly a central factor. There's a great quote that I think that gets at this. There's a man named Todd Conklin, and he comes from the sort of system safety world. And he said that you don't learn about a river by, you can't describe a river by giving its temperature. Right? The temperature is valid at a certain time, valid at a certain place in the river when you took the temperature, but it doesn't tell you about the river. It tells you about a thing about the river. And that's what these sort of shallow metrics sort of tell us about incidents. And so that's what I was hoping to get across in the reading too much into these metrics: frequency, rate, severity. We want, again, driven by uncomfortability about not knowing the future, we want to think that these represent trends. But those connections between incidents don't connect. These are unique, unique places. It needs much more, much richer descriptions for them.
Yeah, it actually seems to me that these shallow metrics are basically only one set of indicators of organizational performance. So if we were to look at these metrics through for example, Kinevin framework, they would be somewhere in the complex domain, because purely looking at them, we cannot predict what needs to be done in order to improve stuff. To find out what we need to improve, we obviously need to ask a different set of questions, right?
Yeah, could not agree more. Could not agree more. But it's difficult, especially for leaders, when they have been used to and certainly have a belief that these metrics do tell a story that's useful for them. I would suggest that upon closer, scrutiny, that it might not be telling the story that they think. Sometimes we'll talk with our clients and we'll show them some data, right, on a chart. It'll be on the y-axis will be sort of the length of time of the incident, or the time of resolve, right, for the incident, and sort of date, right, along the x-axis. And what we'll do is we'll give that to them and we'll say, okay, based on this, can you tell me what happened before the time period that's represented in the chart? And they say, well, we can't. And we said, can you tell us what's going to happen after the time period represented in the chart? Well, they can't. Then the point that you just made, Ivan, is quite stark. There's no sort of explanatory value backwards, and there's no real predictive value forwards. And that leaves us the question: what does it say?
Yeah. It really maps nicely to what you said about the temperature of the river. So exactly, can you predict the temperature tomorrow based on today's temperature? I don't think so.
Or can you? If I give you the temperature, can you tell me how fast the river will flow? Right? Yeah. Where the river will go across the landscape? That's right.
Those are not the same set of questions. I really liked also on the site Learning from Incidents, which we'll also put link to it, how you mentioned that very similar to Agile Manifesto. While we actually very much appreciate values on the right, which are mean time to failure, mean time to recover, and so on. We think that there is much more value in things on the left, which are actually questions like how do people collaborate, how do they share knowledge, how do they perceive the difficulty and handle the difficulty of specific incidents, and so on. So,
yeah, and it's something that is, and I'm over time sort of sharpening my language. These are new ideas, right? Getting especially technical communities to think about things in a different way can be difficult, right? This is the reason why DevOps and continuous delivery wasn't immediately convincing, actually. But yeah, back to your earlier point, the difficulty is really capturing what's difficult for people in an incident, prior to an incident, after an incident is really important. It may be distanced from leaders, but something I feel really confident about is engineers who have responded to incidents, who have experienced that almost sort of palpable, strong feeling in their chest of this uncertainty, like maybe it's this, maybe it's that, I'm not sure. Maybe if we do this thing, it could fix it, but there might be an equal chance that it could make it worse, right? People remember those experiences. Just because we don't describe them in postmortem documents doesn't mean that they aren't some of the most memorable, sometimes even traumatic experiences for people. And if you can capture that, in the talk, my colleague Richard Cook put it to me this way some time ago. He said, how can you tell the difference between a difficult case, a difficult incident handled well, and a straightforward incident handled poorly? I can tell you that it's not the same. Those incidents could both last an hour.
Yeah.
But what engineers, even if it's not written down, what engineers walk away from is a completely different understanding that's not captured in the length of time for it. And so capturing these critically important, that they are subjective, that they can't be measured by a number or a metric. That's what people remember. And if you can't remember an incident, well, let me put it this way. If you can't remember a thing, can you say you've learned it? The teachers that teach my kids say, no, actually, you can't say you've learned something if you can't remember it. So that's sort of the approach.
Yeah. I worked with a number of organizations that are embracing agile way of working. And one thing that we always repeat to them is, if there was only one agile practice that you could implement, please let it be retrospective, because retrospectives are the thing that drive organizational improvements. So typical retrospectives usually focus on themes. How does incident analysis relate to retrospectives? So I imagine there is some kind of overlap between one conversation and the other.
Yeah.
How does this work?
So one of the ways you could think about the difference between what's conventionally known as a retrospective in agile development and incidents. There are a number of I think perhaps obvious similarities. One of the differences is that incident analysis is scoped to a much more contained. The scope of it has in some ways a bit more of a sharp. It's a bit more crisp than let's look at let's have a retrospective look. let's look back on a chunk of work or a project or a part of a project. And as I think most of the expertise in Agile retrospectives would tell you, who is asking the questions and where those questions come from, what makes a facilitator of a retrospective want to dig, zoom in or dig deeper on a particular topic versus pull out and move to a different topic or broaden, are still the same. In incident analysis. Do I still have you?
Yeah, you're here.
Oh, okay. My Teams just the Teams just went blank for a second. So let's just go with it. So yeah, but of course the purpose might be very different. If you are looking to understand a particular project, then you'll within the team's working, then that's a different purpose. It can be a very different purpose than an incident analysis, right? In an incident analysis, the element of time pressure is much more acute. The elements of consequences is much more acute. And by acute, I don't mean just severe, but like I said, sort of crisp and, you can be guaranteed that in an incident, there are varying degrees across the team of significant uncertainty, ambiguity. Yeah. There's what time pressure does is it doesn't allow for a lot of effective repair of misunderstandings, for example, or repair of or hypothesis generation. There's a lot more, there's a lot more sort of individuals stating a hypothesis. I wonder if what we're seeing is this. Sometimes there's questions about what's contributing to the thing. Sometimes there are hypotheses about whether you should pay attention to it or not, whether it's even an incident. And so these are things that are contained in time, and the pressures are slightly amplified. And so as a result, what you would do in a retrospective, an Agile project retrospective would be different. There are similarities, but there are differences. Sorry, a bit vague, but there you have it.
Basically, time pressure and the scope, which is very focused on the incident itself, and the fact that you need to analyze the stuff to learn something to fix it, makes it much different conversation than the one which is actually put in a cadence and okay, let's have it in 2 weeks, then we'll take it easy and think about all the options. I think this is a luxury that you don't have actually in incident analysis. Right?
Yeah, and and one of the things that time pressured events does is bring put a big spotlight, very strong spotlight on things that people think matter. Right? Incidents wipe away. People don't, when there's an incident, people don't engage in activities that they don't think will matter, but might. There's very little gambling, quote unquote. They will look at graphs. They will respond to alerts in ways that they think are important, and they will not look at graphs that they don't think are important. And there's a much broader, much greater diversity on how different multiple people perceive an incident. You know, that parable of the blind men and the elephant, you know, each having a very valid you know, description of what an elephant is. You know, one of the blind men says, oh, an elephant is this big flexible hose. And the other one says, oh, an elephant is like a big, you know, it's a cylinder that goes to the ground. And the other one says, oh, and it's flat like a wall, or it's really a big flappy thing. You know, all of their perspectives are valid, but you need to have all of their perspectives that are different in order to get a richer picture of what an elephant is. And so these, you know, gathering these perspectives in such a sort of acutely, you know, compact, and sometimes really scary event requires different, you know, different approaches than, say, a project that took place over 6 weeks or 8 weeks.
Yeah, definitely. Having all this in mind, could you give us some pointers on how we should behave differently in order for our incident management practice to bring us more value and to the
Yeah.
Are there any specific behaviors, tools, or even methods that you prefer?
Yeah. So there's a couple things I would say. As suggestions, and some of them are a bit more controversial than others. The first one is to, in whatever process you do, the people or the person who's leading a post-incident analysis to not be a stakeholder in the outcome or the technology. They ought not to be somebody who took part in the incident. This can be unintuitive, not very intuitive for people. Normally you'd have somebody who was there, who was involved, because you think, oh, they're much more knowledgeable. That has some significant downsides to it. But by having somebody who was uninvolved and makes no claim to what the organization should do in response will always yield benefits, because they are not the owner of the results. As soon as the analyst, as soon as the person analyzing the incident has a stake in what's done about it, your sort of neutrality in understanding the incident can now be called into question. In a more cynical way, is you could say that the write-up is not a you know, an educational document, it's a political one to further someone's agenda, that sort of thing. So having somebody analyze the incident who was not there and who doesn't have a stake is probably one of the most valuable things you could do. The second is to separate action items, the follow-up generation, from the group incident review meeting. And this is very difficult for engineers. I'm not saying to tell people who come to this, by the way, very expensive meeting to, you know, prohibit them from thinking about, you know, action items. Have them write them down, but state that the focus is understanding the incident from as many perspectives as possible. Punt on coming up with action items to a different meeting. That meeting, the value of having all of those people in the meeting is to contrast the different perspectives. What was important about that incident? What made it really difficult to handle? What made it difficult to anticipate? Does it look like anything that's similar to what we've seen in the past? What does it make you think about the work that you're doing in the future? So if you make that group incident review meeting into a data generation, you know, meeting, instead of a come up with things to fix meeting, then it means that I don't worry about, and neither any organization should not worry about engineers coming up with things to fix, especially on-call engineers. They tend to come up with very good fixes because they don't want to wake up in the middle of the night. You don't have to worry about that. What you do have to worry about is developing a list of things to fix, fueled by a really narrow understanding. Lauren Hochstein and some other folks who work at Netflix have said in multiple places how action items from one incident can quite often become contributing factors in future incidents. And so separating action items generation from the incident review meeting allows you to focus on reviewing the incident, understanding the incident from as many places as you can. Those are two of the easiest things. Sorry, not easiest. Those are the two of the most valuable things you can do. It'll likely lead you to ask other questions like, okay, well then what should we talk about in that meeting? Great. That's where you should have your attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And especially the first one where you don't want the facilitator to be personally or otherwise involved in the incident, because in this way or that, this person will probably be either biased by the events that happened or some kind of consequences afterwards. So it makes perfect sense for third-party independent person to come there and facilitate it.
Yeah,
so, for sure. Moving on to somewhat personal topics, I saw your tweet the other day. You said that you do what you do because you want your children to grow up in a different world where mistakes are seen as a part of a much larger opportunity to understand the socio-technical systems and not just a plot device in simplistic stories of human error. And I think it's a very, very nice way of putting it and very noble thing to do. I mean, I have two daughters. One of them is 13 and she is good at Python. The other one is 10 and she is good at Scratch so far. And this is precisely the world that I would love for them to live in.
Yeah, it's a long game. I've certainly been saying that, I would say that it is the personal motivator for me in doing this work and has been for a long time. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of patience. I would say that the world of software is quite new to this as a goal, but other domains have not. They've been, there are my colleague Richard Cook and David Woods, my professor Sidney Decker, and many others from the world of safety science, human factors, resilience engineering, are motivated by the same thing. And the opportunity that we have in software is almost astronomically larger than those in older domains such as aviation and medicine. There's a whole bunch of things that we just simply don't have to deal. There's a whole bunch of barriers that we don't have that they have in theirs. And I just don't want us to screw that up.
Yeah, I understand completely. It's impossible to talk to you and not to touch upon yours and Paul Hammond's talk from 2009 about 10 plus deploys a day in a Flickr. I rewatched that talk recently, and it's amazing how 10 years later we are actually still talking about the same things. So what do you think about that? It seems to me like if there was a problem with tools or technology, I'm sure that we would fix it by now. But somehow, like problem is in some intangible stuff around us.
Yeah. Well, to some extent, so yeah, so how I feel about those topics and sort of where and how they have come to be where they are in the state of the domain is mixed. I mean, on the one hand, I am pretty, I wouldn't say jaded, certainly more than disappointed about how about how easy it is and has been for um, for companies to I'm gonna say this without really pulling any punches, to hijack there's those early days, 2009, 2010, and Velocity wasn't just our talk. Adam Jacob, who was at Opscode, which later became Chef, gave an amazing talk and said pretty straightforward, DevOps is not a tool. DevOps is not a business. DevOps is not a feature. You cannot buy DevOps. You cannot get sort of pull one off the shelf. And yet, that's exactly what happened, which is that the assertion that there was a long time early, there was some vigorous debate early on about whether or not the naming of a team, DevOps, was a thing to do. And I'm still of the mind that I think it's a terrible idea. But it was available. It was new. DevOps. Agile before it, right? And paradigms and sort of concepts in multiple domains say that this happens. It possibly happens faster in software, but it happens elsewhere. So in that way, I'm pretty disappointed. On the other hand, I am quite, I'm quite happy about these communities, multiple communities in the software world, talking about behaviors, talking about social influences, talking about these necessarily subjective elements of the work, and wrestling with them is important. I would like to say that we, inadvertently somehow tricked a bunch of software engineers to learn a little bit more about psychology and sociology without saying that out loud. But I'll take that. I think that's important. The fact of the matter is making software and making it work. All of the stuff that's involved is a social activity. That cannot be, that can't be denied, as much as we want to focus on, unless, despite the fact that it's much easier to pretend that it's not. I'm happy that introducing these topics has come to where it's come.
Well, I just think that if you did trick somebody into a bit of psychology and sociology, I think you did the world a favor. So don't beat yourself too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. I'll take that.
John, can you tell us what you read these days and who are the interesting people that you follow that make you think differently and do better?
Yeah, well, I will say that gladly, I will answer that. It is very difficult to overstate how satisfying it is for me that communities, and I really mean cross-industry communities, are not only willing to learn, but also write and share what they're learning and how they see that sort of playing out in the real world, not in some sort of conceptual academic way. You mentioned earlier the Learning from Incidents website, the learningfromincidents.io, the Nora Jones, absolutely pivotal in wrangling, coordinating like-minded sort of what I would call sort of fellow travelers. Certainly Nora Jones, all of the folks that J. Paul Reed, Jessica DeVita, Lauren Huckstein, Laura McGuire. These are people who are involved, and Ryan Kitchens. The list goes on. Probably the best way to understand and sort of finding folks to talk with and follow would be probably the Learning from Incidents.io, and pull on those threads. That'll lead you to sort of to others. Yeah, I would say that. As to what I'm reading everything I can possibly get my hands on. That's no different than it always has been. At this juncture, you know, being able, the work continues, right? The work continues to describe, and in this case, in my capacity, in my role at Adaptive Capacity Labs, is to write more, to describe, just like at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, these you know, sometimes really complicated concepts to an ever-broadening audience. Sometimes that means saying the same thing but different words. Sometimes, you know, developing new sort of routes, analogies to sort of describe that, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's tremendously useful for people who are just entering this area to see some kind of introduction that really resonates with them and that they can comprehend at the beginning. I remember seeing also a quote from Angie Jones. She said that she was looking for some kind of explanation for something, a tutorial, and she passed by 4 of them, and she didn't like the way it was written and the way that the message was pushed to the other side, and she was actually encouraging people to write more and deliver this content, because there are different people and different people need different ways of receiving the information. So the things that I saw on Learning from Incidents was great, and it really helped me a lot to clear up some of the confusion in my head. So thank you for that.
Yes. Excellent. I would say, in order to, you know, as I'm actually quite terrible at marketing, but I will say that Learning from Incidents, reading what people have written there, writing about, I would suggest to anybody watching this who's interested, read the articles that are posted there, read the articles that we've written on our blog at adaptivecapacitylabs.com, and reach out to the authors. Something doesn't make sense, like, I don't understand this. Reach out to them. We're all connected by the internet. And wrestling with these difficult things, just like you mentioned, like I like that story from Angie Jones. Yes, do that. Do what Angie does. Do what Angie did, and engage with this stuff. Wrestle with it. Call bullshit on it. You know, we're not looking to build you know, We're not looking to build a monoculture of thinkers. We're looking to expand what critical thinking and system thinking looks like in the domain.
Yeah, this is definitely not a zero-sum game. So
exactly.
Yeah. Sure. John, thank you for your time. This has been a great afternoon for me. So at least here in on this part of the world.
Yes,
So,
yes.
thank you so much, and hopefully we'll meet in person one day.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. And I've always wanted to go to Croatia. My friend Zoran Perkov is Croatian, and he has told me about how absolutely beautiful the country is. And so I hope to one day go.
Well, if you happen to pass by here, so please let me know.
I will extend the same to you if you ever come to New York.
Thank you so much, John.
Okay.
Thanks and bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Ivan. Bye.
Bye.